Okay, welcome everybody. We're covering the other works of George R. R. Martin. My name is Amin. I'm from a podcast of Ice and Fire, and I'm joined by my friend Duncan.
Hi there, my name's Duncan. I also go by Valkyrist on the internet, and I'm one of the hosts of the Vassals of Kingsgrave Podcast, which is a listener-made spin-off of a podcast of Ice and Fire.
Yeah, and today we're talking about the other works of George R. R. Martin. This is actually I got into this area specifically when I was waiting for Feast for Crows to come out, um, but I think that's relevant now as well. Whenever you're waiting for George to release his works, you have to realize that George is actually been a writer for decades now. Like this is not a Song of Ice and Fire is not his first work. It's he's done a lot of other work, and that's what we're going to discuss today. And I chose for the slide here a song for Laya because I remember when I first went to the library to look for other works from George, I saw one of these. I saw the cover with the lips, and I'm like, is this really George's book? Like, what is this thing? And that kind of maybe slowed me getting into his works for a few months before I decided to
Oh,
actually read it.
the covers are so bizarre of some
Yeah.
of these short stories. They're really out there. And yeah, it is funny, like, because obviously most of us here would have gotten into George's work through A Song of Ice and Fire, but that's basically towards the end of his career. He was
Hmm.
actually a writer throughout the 70s and 80s, mostly working in science fiction, but also horror, and then more and more fantasy until his sort of magnum opus with A Song of Ice and Fire. So there is heaps of content out there that George has written. So if you're starved for the next A Song of Ice and Fire book, there's heaps of stuff to get through. So go back to his short stories and novels.
And that's what we're kind of going to discuss today is a bit of that. You can see that George's development over time in the various works here leading up to Ice and Fire. Some people have various views of like whether there's actually a direct connection, but certainly there's a literary development of a writer here, and we'll talk about that today. So I will move forward here to the next slide. I can see just to talk about a few quotes from George and the way he views different literary genres. George doesn't really view science fiction, fantasy, horror, and other genres that separately. As you can see from some of the quotes here, he really just sees them all as just like ice cream. Maybe they're different flavors of ice cream, chocolate or strawberry, but they're still the same thing. And whether you're talking about, giants, elves, dwarves, or human characters, or aliens, it's just all about the struggles of the human heart and the conflict with itself. That's George's philosophy. And that's the way he views these genres.
Yeah, I attended the virtual Worldcon last year that was meant to be in New Zealand, but ended up just being on Zoom.
Hmm.
And he ran one of the panels, and I asked him that question. Is there a difference between science fiction and fantasy? And he basically said the same thing. Although I think he used the analogy of like furniture, like
Hmm.
some sci-fi has this kind of furniture, spaceships and whatnot, and fantasy has castles and throne rooms and things, but they're essentially doing very similar things. It's all sort of speculative. Magic is science fiction by another name, I guess.
And I think that that's probably one of the reasons why. I mean, other than the fact that he's just a great writer generally, that he is able to do well in all these different genres because of that viewpoint. Like, if you had a
Mm.
different viewpoint, you probably wouldn't be interested in writing certain genres, even let alone doing well in them. And he was able to move to three different genres. So we have an outline here, just kind of what we're going to talk about in general. We'll talk with kind of the fantasy and closest link first, Ice and Fire, like the closest in theme, Ice Dragon, and then kind of move on to the way George started, which was mostly in science fiction. So some different works under science fiction and other works really there. But George is actually quite well known in the horror like sphere, and he's won award. He has award-winning works there. So we'll start in horror and talk about some other works. And this panel we usually do live at Ice and Fire. We have it now online. So question and answers we'll go over at the end. You can still send questions for us if you have any via Twitter or Facebook, and we'll get back to you after the panel. So let's start with the Ice Dragon, which actually has been adapted a few different times. I mean, it was written first before, like decades ago, when George was living. I don't remember. I think it was in Iowa, Dubuque, or somewhere around there, and it was a very harsh winters there, right? So I think it inspired his writing for
Yes,
this work.
he has several short stories which are very cold, and they all seem to originate when he was living in a cold climate. The Ice Dragon and Bitter Blooms is another very
Mm.
frosty novel that he wrote in cold climates.
And this work is kind of interesting because he said that when he wrote it, um, initially he just was a general short story, but then somebody kind of told him, or if he figured it out, this actually could be like a children's novel. So that's why it was redone with the Yvonne Gilbert edition. It was redone as a children's novel, but it's a children's novel with like mutilation and war and like implied rape and all these things that like, I mean, it's not really a children's novel, but look, they cut it down a bit. They actually changed the text a little bit in that version to try to make it palatable for kids.
Yeah, there's a couple of paragraphs they excised from the children's version, including this sort of march of defeated soldiers describing their various war wounds.
Mm.
And yeah, there is an incident in a house that he had to cut also, or sort of made a bit more ambiguous, which was quite disturbing. It's funny that he calls it a children's story, though, because even setting aside those sort of gruesome bits, the tone of the story I found so sort of melancholic and
Mm.
depressing. Um, I mean, it is. I mean, it's set from a child's point of view, and it sort of has a happy ending at the end. But it's quite an emotional book. But I guess some of the best children's stories are emotional.
I think it would be interesting because I don't know anyone who has actually had their child read this to see what a child's perspective would be. I mean, like it's just been Ice and Fire fans that have read this. And I do in the newer version, like the new, I don't know if it was, I think the newest version does with Louis Royot. The jacket even says this is in the universe of Ice and Fire. It was just an editor's ploy. It has nothing to do with that. Like it has themes from it. It's inspired. Like it's some of the things that worked in this work, like his other works, appear later. But it really is not the same thing. You could make some grand theory that it is, but it's not. It's just a ploy to sell it. But who cares? Who cares if it's in?
Yeah.
That's
No,
not the point. It's the same writer.
yeah, I don't think it's literally in the same universe, but you
Yeah.
can see some of the same DNA, some of the same ideas and themes. Like I saw a lot of Arya in the little
Mm.
girl that is the protagonist of the story. And just the fantasy setting has a few archetypal characters. Like there's kind of a Benjen character in it. There's a reference to the King's Road, things like that. So he's working with a few of these ideas that would eventually be fleshed out in A Song of Ice and Fire. Um, it's funny though, thinking about the book as a short story. It just occurred to me it's kind of similar to that children's story, Where the Wild Things Are, because that's
Mm.
also a book about a kid who just can't deal with his emotions and gets kind of rejected by his parents, and then goes off into this sort of fantasy world of his own creation. So I think, yeah, there is a bit of a precedent with those kinds of children's stories.
I think the approach that I take generally is I try to, like when I read these George's previous works, I do learn more about Ice and Fire, but it's not because they're like connected to the same world or anything. It's just that the writing styles, the themes, the views of life and war, are the roots are there and they get developed later. So that's how people think that it has to be also be connected just literally like it's like somehow the same universe. That's not the way you get insight. At least not the way I get insight reading these previous works.
And also thematically, I think this story very much connects to Song of Ice and Fire in terms of like this tension between romance and like realism, or sort
Mm.
of de-romanticizing things, because you have this really wondrous being or beast in the ice dragon that the little girl discovers, but it also set against this backdrop of this really horrible war that initially all the villagers are quite excited by, but as the war gets closer and closer, becomes quite a frightening thing and becomes more in the realm of sort of the adult world. So I think
Mm.
he definitely plays into that in A Song of Ice and Fire with a lot of the younger characters, you know, the young sort of Stark children, very excited about the prospect of adventure and battle and the knights, and then slowly coming into contact with the harsh reality of the world.
You know when the Louis Royal version came out, I was actually really excited because I always for a long time thought Louis Royal would be a nice fit for George to illustrate some of his works, and he did a really good job with the dragons part. But it was a bit of disappointing that it was this one because the main character is a young child and he doesn't really draw young children. He's known for doing mystical beasts and beautiful women, so he could do half the equation here, but
Right,
but not
right.
the other half. Any other George work I think would have been better, but I still enjoyed it. It was still a good adaptation. So I guess we'll move on to some of his other George's other works, and as we talked about earlier, just the cover art for his works is just part of the enjoyment for going through some of these early works. There's so many different uh, types of artwork. Like the one in the top left is done by a pretty good artist, and I actually have a copy of that analog short story. I got it signed by George. Second Kind of Loneliness, and that's actually how George started a lot of his works. He started with short fiction, short stories, right?
He did, yeah. That was most of what he did in the 70s and the 80s. He wrote
Hmm.
three novels by himself before A Song of Ice and Fire, and then he sort of did some co-novels with some other authors. But most of what he wrote was short stories, and I think his short stories are sort of my favorite of his works. I would highly recommend pretty much all of his short stories. Um, Even over the novels. Like the novels are good too, but the short stories I think are where he's experimenting the most
Hmm.
and doing the most kind of radical, interesting, powerful work.
I think that's
Um,
George's view on for new writers. He often does recommend they start with short stories because it's just easier to start with something with that set time, like set page limit and set arc before you go to your massive novella or novel.
mm, yeah, yeah, absolutely. I would, speaking of covers, I would highly recommend people go to George's website and check
Mm.
out all the different covers from different countries of A Song of Ice and Fire, publications of A Song of Ice and Fire and his novels and his short collections, because there's some really, really cool stuff out there. Um, and yeah, you know, book covers can be so powerful in evoking a mood or just kind of wrapping you up in an idea. Covers are so important, even though someone else does them, but they're so important. It's kind of like the first impression you get of a book and the kind of window into an author's work. So they are really important.
I guess I'll give a very quick synopsis of some of the works here because I don't want to get in details, but just what they're about. Second Kind of Loneliness just kind of talks about different types of loneliness, the type that's maybe when you're out in nature or something versus the type where you're actually surrounded by a crowd of people but you feel lonely. George is kind of dealing with that feeling. Song for Lia deals with some interested, again, philosophical and religious views in a science fiction setting. The top right is one of our favorite. We actually have been doing ongoing reviews in Vassals of Kingsgrave and Vassals of Kingsgrave of these works of George, and that deals with the pear-shaped man. I think that's a Japanese cover in the top right, and it's kind of like this horror story with was it Cheetos or cheese puffs or whatever, like whatever the
Cheese doodles?
cheese doodles. Yeah, he makes
Yeah,
cheese doodles scary.
only only George could make cheese doodles the most terrifying thing ever. And I think that was our longest episode to date.
Yes.
We reviewed that story for about 2 hours, and about a quarter of that discussion was us going to the cheese doodle website and just being blown away by the website. It's one of the strangest websites we've ever seen. So it's a window
Mm.
into madness, that book.
So then it's a great story. Each of these work, I haven't regretted reading any of George's previous stories. They vary in quality, but I've enjoyed them all to some degree. So certainly enjoying that. I guess we'll move on a bit to maybe a more targeted discussion, although we won't go into too much detail. There's Tough Voyaging because this is some of George's science fiction works. Most of his science fiction is in one kind of like universe, right? Like is it the Thousand Worlds is the kind of informal name for it, right?
Yeah, that's what he calls it. So about half of his short stories, his first novel, Dying of the Light, and then his kind of fix-up novel, Tough Voyaging, which started as short stories, but he eventually combined them into a collection. They all take place in the same universe, which is funny because we think of A Song of Ice and Fire as his big series that he wrote,
Mm-hmm.
but he did technically write a series prior to that in the 70s and the 80s, which he calls the Thousand Worlds series. um, they're not quite as coherent as a series as A Song of Ice and
Mm-hmm.
Fire. Like the stories often don't share the same characters, the exception being Tough Voyaging, which follows Tough throughout the galaxy on various adventures.
Yeah, Tough Voyaging is I think exactly the same character, the same time period, because a lot of the other stories span huge different time periods, right? But you have Tough within his time period, going through various different scenarios on different planets, and it just like this is a lot of like I think the earliest book might have been in the late 70s. Like George dealing with things like genetic engineering and stuff really early back then, like that not many other people
Mm.
were thinking about uh, in this work. So we actually haven't covered this one. This might be the next thing that we cover on the
Mhm.
podcast reviews. But it is I've enjoyed all the Tough Voyaging stories, and there's some people that have been waiting for the next Tough Voyaging stories since the last one. I think it was late 80s. So they've been waiting for that. They're like, when's the next Tough story?
Yeah, I have to admit, I haven't read any of the Tough Voyaging stories, so I am
Mm.
keen to do a podcast on them. But if anyone's interested and wants to join the podcast, the Tough Voyaging podcast, or send questions or things they want us to talk about with
Mm-hmm.
Tough Voyaging, definitely send us a tweet or send us a message.
Sure, and we'll have our contact information at the end of the presentation, so put that there. You talked about Dying of the Light. That was, I think that was George's first novel, I believe, right? Dying of the Light.
It was, yeah, that was his first novel, and it's set in the Thousand Worlds universe. And the kind of the premise of the universe, or what ties all the stories together, is that it takes place after this sort of catastrophic event called the Interregnum. So there was a big war between humanity and two alien species, and it basically fragmented all of the civilizations of the human civilizations of the galaxy. Everything fell apart. All the communications between the different planets were lost, and then slowly over hundreds of years connections started, communication between the different human settlements started to be, you know, reconnected or
Hmm.
rekindled. And these stories are kind of set in the aftermath of that sort of collapse and revival of human civilization.
Yeah, Dying of the Light. One of the main characters, or several of the main characters, are what I like to call space Dothraki. Like they,
Mm,
you can kind of see that kind of bit of connection there, and just like
yeah.
George's view of like what happens to different planet. Like George, you think about it, like he really spans the full spectrum of what could be human civilization, like what
Mm.
different conditions. If you think about the last few books, short stories we reviewed, he really gets there, right? He goes to like all the different forms of like, well, at least he could view where humans go. And so Dying the Light doesn't do that specifically because it deals with a couple of cultures, it does a few of them, but it also it is reflective of the point. I think many writers draw upon their own experiences in their work. Some admit it, some don't. George certainly does admit it, and Dying the Light and some of these other earlier works really do draw upon his own personal experiences and relationships and romances and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a strong theme of sort of loneliness in a lot of his stories and sort of this seeking for human connection.
Hmm.
You see that in Dying of the Light, A Song for Lyre, the second kind of loneliness, this sort of strong desire to connect with other people, but this kind of inability to do so, or this kind of this fear of never truly being connected with another people. And also Dying of the Light has this really strong melancholic tone of having it's being set on this planet that was once full of life and music
Mm.
and culture and art, but has drifted too far away from from its star and is slowly sort of freezing over and becoming uninhabitable. So that's another, I think, strong theme in a lot of George's works, including A Song of Ice and Fire, that the characters live in the kind of shadow of this much greater um, civilization that is slowly falling apart and decaying, and they look back on it with nostalgia, and find it difficult to adapt to the new world.
I find it interesting that I had this slide with these other works here because it kind of jumps around. I think we still have more of George's science fiction works, but then we have Fever Dream, which is kind of like this historical, kind of semi-fantasy historical work in our world, like admittedly in our world. We reviewed that recently,
Yeah.
and then his whole steamboats obsession, right, is there.
Fever Dream's really interesting because yeah, it isn't set in a science fiction universe. It's mostly a historical novel that he kind of introduces these kind of horror elements to. It's funny because we described it's a vampire novel essentially, but we described it as primarily a book about steamboats because much of the book is devoted to describing steamboat culture and the steamboat scene on the Mississippi River in the South during the sort of antebellum period. But yeah, there's also some horror elements and some adventure elements and whatnot. But yeah, I really enjoyed Fever Dream. I'd recommend it.
Then moving on to another kind of big contrast is Windhaven. I don't know, have you had the chance to read that, Duncan?
No, I haven't read this one. No.
Yeah, and what's interesting about Windhaven is it's, I mean, it's one of George's few works where he worked directly with one other author, and you can kind of see that this work was made by two different people. You can see George's influence, and then you can see things that probably came from Lisa Tuttle. And it's a good story. I enjoyed Windhaven. I think, if I recall correctly, it's kind of a couple of, I don't know if they started as short stories and were put together. It certainly has several certain stories, kind of like Tough Voyaging, that deal with different issues that are related,
Mm.
and it was good. We'll have to cover that at some point. But and I will mention Lisa Tuttle. I mean, George openly talks about his previous relationship with on his own website. About if you read because he has a kind of a biography of his life there. And Lisa Tuttle was in a relationship with George, didn't work out. They're friends now, but that whole experience ties into like even Dying the Light potentially. I think Lisa Tuttle might have inspired a character. She certainly inspired some characters in some of his earlier works. That whole relationship. So it's interesting to then see that they actually had this collaboration, this work together. I guess when they were together, they wrote this work. So,
Mhm.
all right, so let's move on here to some more horror slash science fiction. Horror and a science. That's the thing. George is, as he said, it just he mixes it all together and he gets to whatever he wants to write. Basically, he whatever tools or furniture or background he wants. Any comments on Night Flyers or Sand Kings?
I love them both. They're probably up
Mm,
there as two of my favorite of his works. Sand Kings was the novel, the work that I think he was most famous for
mm.
prior to A Song of Ice and Fire. Like that got him a lot of awards and a lot of recognition
He had a whole full
as an
shelf of
author.
awards before I said fire. People don't know. Like, not only was he writing these is award winning works. A lot of these works, like he
Yeah.
had Hugo's, Nebulas, everything. Like he
Sand Kings I found really disturbing and
mm,
frightening. And it's also a novel, it's also a story in which the protagonist is quite hideous and unlikable.
mm,
So you a lot of the time you just feel quite grossed out by inhabiting this person's brain, even before the sort of monstrous elements are introduced. But that's a really scary, nasty little work with an awesome sort of ending. I think it was even adapted into an Outer Limits episode in the 1980s. I think
it
that was
was. It might have been
one of
one
the
of the
works.
first ones. I'm not sure. Yeah, it was a first.
So,
It was a two-parter even. Like they changed it a
yeah.
bit too much. Like one of the reasons I put these two is because these works actually are getting a lot of adaptations. They already had some, and then now because
Mm.
of George's fame, they're getting even more. So Sand Kings, I believe, might be being adapted again. I don't know the full details, but it did have that one. Night Flyer certainly was adapted again. I haven't seen it, the newer version. There's that older when it says now a major motion picture. That's the original one from like 20 years ago. Plus, that I think it had like Uncle Phil's character in it from Fresh Prince. I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've seen the trailer. I recognize Uncle Phil was there.
Yeah.
Most of what I remember from the trailer it was just how much smoke machine was used. Like I feel like the 1980s was a golden age for smoke machines. Um, but the Night Flies is another really great one.
Mm,
Yeah, it's a mix. It's mostly sci-fi, but with some strong horror elements. I've heard it described as Psycho in space,
mm.
um, and also some sort of very similar to the movie Alien by Ridley Scott. There's some elements there. I think it was released almost the same year, or maybe even a year before
Mm.
Alien, and there's a very similar scene in both of them. But that's a really good one, and that's quite a long one. That's a novella, so it's probably his longest short story that I'm aware of, but I would highly recommend both of those.
George certainly does kind of push the line, even when he has short stories. It's like, well, is it a short story? Is it so long? Like he pushes it to the limit. Is it a novella
Mm,
now? Whatever it is, he always pushes it to the longer limit. But Sand Kings actually even had a graphic novel. I think it was, I mean, comic book they called it back then. They call it now graphic novel. But like I have it from I think from the late '80s, maybe early '90s. It's that certain '80s feel to it. It's really cool. I really love the artwork of it. That's another aspect actually. If you're into the more like the collecting side of things, like there's a lot of these earlier George works are still out there. You can get your own actual copy from it or collect it, get it signed. Like that aspect is also there if you're looking to like collect things from George's writings and they're just
yeah,
gorgeous. They're good condition. A lot of them.
yeah. I managed to find a few. I went to a market a couple of months ago, and I was looking through some issues of Analog, and I found a
Mm.
couple of George's original short stories. So I made sure to grab those, and they even within the short story they'll include some artwork, which is always cool to see the original artwork that was created for the first
Well,
publication of
even
the
that.
story.
I'll go back to that. The top left, second kind of loneliness. George had the option to buy the original like art painting for that way
Mm,
back when, and I think it initially was like I don't know, $500 or something. And for him at that time, it was too expensive, right? Like he was a young author. And then he said, like the last time I heard, it was being sold for like 30,000, 40,000. Of course, now it might even be
oh,
higher. Like he's like, I wish I had bought it back
wow.
then. Although he could afford it now,
Yeah.
if he wanted to buy it. I mean, he's buying railways. He could buy that
Yeah.
painting
Yeah.
if he wanted now. Maybe he has that painting now. Okay, so Meat House Man is probably the most one of the most extreme works. And again, George himself, I think he admits he took from his own experiences, of course, exaggerated here, but like drew upon the pain of his personal experiences, like in writing this story. And this is the this picture is the graphic novel adaptation by Rhea Golden, who's actually one of his assistants and does really good artwork. And she's now doing this. I'm glad that she had the opportunity to do so because she did a good job with it. So, have you read Meat House Man?
I have. Yeah, this is an incredible work. Very disturbing. It's probably one of my favorite of his. Um, and it's funny to call it a horror. story because there's certainly some horrific imagery
Mm.
in it. Like the premise is that he inhabits this kind of outer mining colony where they use like human corpses for like manual labor. So he gets corpses to mine areas, but they also use corpses for prostitution, and he occasionally visits them. Um, which is a very disturbing idea. But the most disturbing parts are actually sort of his internal um, psychology or his internal conflict between wanting to find a connection, wanting to find a girlfriend, having feelings for people, but not having those feelings requited, and then kind of seeking out these corpse brothels, as they're called, as a way of escaping or a way of sort of finding human connection. It's very sad, very disturbing. I feel like it has a weird resonance with today's kind of internet culture. Like there's a
Hmm.
lot of people on the internet who are very lonely, very sort of resentful and spiteful, and have just kind of used, virtual reality as a way of escaping and sort of recreating their life the way they want it. So I don't know. I feel like there's some definitely some subcultures that have emerged on the internet that I feel like there's a lot of, I don't know, I recognize a lot of what they talk about and what they're going through in this character that appears in Meat House Man. So it's sort of a very, you know,
It's like
timeless
it's
tale in
exactly.
a
I'm saying
way. Just,
timeless. It's not just set. Like it's something that is relevant to any period, like this type of
yeah,
situation or certain people. Like
it's a
exactly.
very, yeah, it's a very specific, like, male loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that they're sort of, yeah, he's sort of taught, I don't know, there's something about his personality that he struggles to show emotion, he struggles to connect with people, and that struggle sort of manifests itself in really unhealthy ways. So it's a really, really powerful book,
Mm-hmm.
or story, I felt, but very
And
disturbing, not for the faint of heart.
exactly. In fact, I wouldn't. That's true. Like perhaps like Meat House Man, for example, is a work that I could not recommend to everyone. Like it depends
Mm,
on what kind of reader you are, what kind of thing you can handle. Certainly, this would be on the more extreme side. I wouldn't start with it.
mm.
So it depends what you can handle. That's a good point. Um, there's some other works. The Hunter's Run, I think that's more recent. I have not read that, and it's kind of a collaboration. But the Armageddon Rag, I have read it, and what's interesting about that is it's the one that actually ended George's career for a while, writing career. Like it basically I think he got a big advance for it, but it didn't sell, so he ended up having to work in Hollywood for a while, and then eventually come back when he came back to the Game of Thrones. Um, have you read
Yeah,
it?
it's sort of, no, I haven't read this one. All I
Hmm.
know that is of it is that it's set in the 60s, and it has something to do with Lord of the Rings. Like he follows a rock band that calls themselves the Nazguls or something like that.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it's not actually really.
Um,
It's from people from the '60s. I think it's a little bit later. It's people kind of like
okay,
reflecting post '60s, but it is kind of
right.
traces that history. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, it is interesting. It sounded like it was one of the books he had a lot of freedom for. Like,
yeah.
Fever Dream's good, but it's quite a sort of a, not generic, but it's sort of, you feel like it's um it's a genre piece. Like you feel
Hmm.
like there's a lot of things that he's um that have been done before, and he just tries to do them in a new way. Whereas Armageddon Rag seems wholly original and wholly a passion project. But yeah, sadly, readers did not enjoy it. And yeah, he was writing a fourth novel, in fact, that he had intended to publish, and he wrote about a quarter of it, and it was called Black and White and Red All Over. And it was sort of
Hmm.
set in late 19th century New York, and it was about Jack the Ripper possibly coming to New York, and set from the perspective of these sort of newspaper reporters. Um, and it is available, the sort of quarter that he did write is available in a collection called Quartet.
Hmm.
But he couldn't get an advance on the work. He sent it to various publishers, and none of them wanted to buy it because Armageddon Rag had failed so miserably. So he just eventually abandoned that work and then started writing for Hollywood until finally he had the idea of A Song of Ice and Fire.
Although what is it, when we've discussed this, is I guess some period before A Song of Ice and Fire, he was writing like the book that was going to be like his capstone for the Thousand Worlds, like Avalon, right? So he was kind of chipping away at that. Yeah, of course, he didn't release it anywhere or do anything with it, but
Yeah,
he that was when he was going to try to arc back from there, and then he went to Ice and Fire, like this new. this
Yeah,
new thing.
and he describes, I think it's even in Quartet, he
Yeah.
describes writing Avalon and how he envisioned it. He describes it as a science fiction war and peace. So this book, which was, meant to be the culmination of his Thousand Worlds series or universe, was
Hmm.
meant to be his magnum opus. But 3 chapters in, he just had this vision of children finding direwolves in the snow, and that basically he just followed that vision and started writing, and eventually came up with this short story, which would eventually become the first chapter of A Song of Ice and Fire. So he put Avalon in a drawer and just started following the A Song of Ice and Fire story, and eventually that became what it is today. And Avalon, I guess, is still sitting in that drawer.
Well, it makes you wonder that if he had continued in that with the Avalon book, or maybe even a series, if he would have kind of dealt with the same themes and stuff and perfected them more in there instead of Ice and Fire. Like, I wonder if that's what it would have resulted in.
Possibly. He sketches a bit of an outline in Quartet of what it was meant to be about. I
Hmm.
think he describes it as having, I mean, it's set on the planet of Avalon, which is kind of a civilization in the Thousand Worlds. It's like a center of learning. It has the center of human knowledge on it, so it's a big university, and it's set from the point of view of like 3 different characters from 3 different worlds in the galaxy and their relationship to each other. But that's basically all he says. So who knows what else was going to happen?
Avalon itself is like, as you said, like the center of knowledge, and it never really. I don't think it ever lost space flight, or like it had it. Maybe it didn't contact other places. It kept the knowledge. It helped reestablish it at different places. So it's always referred to all the time as being like this incredible place. So it would have been nice to see it. It would you'd think it would have an influence on the rest of the worlds. Like that's what the storyline would be dealing with, whatever went there.
Yeah,
So.
well, yeah, it is. Martin describes it as a very important planet in the Thousand Worlds series. I don't think we ever actually go there in any of the short stories, except for maybe I think at the beginning of Night Flyers, that's where they set
Hmm.
sail from. That's where the characters set sail from. But it's always regarded as very important. Like Dying of the Light, the characters used to live on Avalon, and they refer to it a lot. um, and it's kind of like, yeah, it's kind of like the library of humanity, like everything that was lost during the interregnum, during the collapse of human civilization. The Avalonians kind of try and preserve and sort of regather from all the sort of ruined civilizations of the galaxy.
Okay, that's wild cards. Is an interesting one. I never really got into wild cards because here George mostly does the editing. I think he's maybe done some writing as well. But it's just it was so out of my. Well, here's the way I view it. I'm when I'm reading George, I want to read George. Now, if he's with one other person, 2 other persons, you get part George. But then you decide dilute it. Like this is no longer. I don't ever consider this in the George area of work. It's just some work. You may enjoy, you may not, but it's not what I'm looking for. So that's why I
I,
never got into it.
I always feel sorry for Wildcards because I feel like it's become the antagonist of the A Song of Ice and Fire fandom, because its main sin being that it's not A Song of Ice and Fire, and any
Yeah.
any work that Martin dedicates to it is taken away from the A Song of Ice
Yeah.
and Fire fandom. I haven't read any of the books. A couple of the short stories that George wrote were included in his Dream Songs collection,
Hmm.
so I read those and they were quite enjoyable. It's basically like a superhero themed series where I think an asteroid sort of lands on Earth or flies over Earth, and it releases radiation and it produces all of these mutations in the human population. And some humans become mutants, some sort of develop superpowers. So it's meant to be sort of, and I think that occurs in the 1950s or something, and it's kind of like an alternate history version. Like, what if superheroes existed in the real world and had an influence on historical events? So it's definitely an interesting idea for a series, and I enjoyed the stories that Martin wrote. And I think I kind of am interested in reading it just to see how it compares to like the superhero culture of today, like Marvel and DC.
Hmm.
It's kind of interesting to see how novelists would sort of take that idea and write it as in a sort of novel form rather than a graphic novel form. Um, but yeah, sadly, it's not A Song of Ice and Fire, so
I think
it
George
must be
wrote some of the
destroyed.
characters in it. I think the turtle or something like he really. In fact, the world may have, if I'm remembering correctly, kind of came about from George and a bunch of his friends. Maybe played it like a role playing game or kind of like this kind of gaming world or something. It was kind of that kind of collaborative process that that generated, and then he
Yeah.
ran with it basically.
Yeah, which is really cool. Like I think it was developed like he had a role in almost like the producer of a TV show or something. Like
Hmm.
he formulated the overall outline of what the story would be, and then they each kind of took different characters to write about.
You're right that it was the scapegoat for a long time before all the other things that Jordan, before there was like the HBO series. This was the scapegoat. It was like, oh, he's working on wild cards before, but like that's something that, I mean, people like to do. It's not accurate. Like you have to get to the point. Like if George wasn't doing this, he'd just be watching TV. Like if George's not going to do writing, he's not going to do it. It's not that other things are taking his time. He's either
Hmm.
not going to write or he's going to write. Like he either has a mental block or he only can write for a certain amount of hours. So if that's the way you view it, it's almost like you prefer he at least write something else instead of just playing like some computer game or something. I think there was some game he said he played and then he said I'm not going to do this. He doesn't have time to do that. He
Yeah,
almost got an
yeah.
RPG game,
It
so
it
that's the way I view it.
exactly. Yeah, it's editing is a completely different process to writing.
Hmm.
So it's not like because he's editing, he's writing less. They're two different activities. Um, And yeah, I don't know. It's hard to speculate. I feel like half the time the fandom is just speculating on when the next
Yeah. Well, we
when
had
the
this
next
discussion.
Sunlight Spy is coming out, but
We had discussion quite a
we
few times. Yeah.
could never replace it.
Well, and not necessarily on the timeline, but the whole issue of like, well, what if George just gave up on writing the series? Like, I mean, there are writers that just cannot finish their work. Like, they just get to the point that they cannot. It's like a roadblock, and they move. And if you look at George's history of writing, it almost seems like he may have done that with certain works. Like he did something where he could have done more there, but he just moved on. And this is the first time where he's been locked into a series and he can't really leave because of his commitments. Before he could always just move on to some other story, right? He didn't have to
Yeah,
do a sequel.
yeah, and he talks about that in Dream Songs, in fact, because Dream Song is a collection of his works, but it also includes kind of biographical information written by George himself, where he sort of
Hmm.
introduces each story. And yeah, he talks about various series that he started but then abandoned. Like there was the Meat House Man was originally part of a trilogy called the Corpse Trilogy
Hmm.
that he was going to try and turn into a book. Um, and there was a few other things like that. Black and White and Red All Over. He abandoned Avalon. He abandoned. So there have been projects that he started and just didn't quite sort of light a fire in him. But there was kind of no expectation, so he just it didn't matter that he abandoned them. Whereas he's put so much more into this series and got so much more expectation that he's kind of trapped between a rock and a hard place. But who knows? Again, we're speculating on his psychology, but we really have no idea what's going
Oh
on.
yeah, yeah. We have no idea of his psychology, but we have the result of like there's no book for 10 years, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
like
yeah,
whatever the cause it's not coming out. Like we don't know
yeah.
the exact result. We only have those objective facts. And what makes it interesting when you read all these previous works, it's almost like the way the point that I got to, because everyone gets to the different place of what they expect with Ice and Fire. I got to the point that like if George said I'm finished with it, then okay, you're finished with that. You can't do it. That's up to you. That's your life. You want to move on to something else? I'll take it because I enjoy reading everything you write. Like I don't have to see the end of this, but that's just my own conclusion. I'm sure many people are still very invested in the series and want an ending from George, and they would be like utterly disappointed. But I would not be. I'd say, look, I've enjoyed reading these books, and ready for the next like whatever thing you want to do.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And
This is go
it's
ahead.
a shame because he is past retirement age. He probably
Hmm.
wants to retire, but he's he's put so much into it. I'm sure he wants to finish it.
I'm sure he certainly wants to finish it because yeah, it's magnum opus. He wants it to be good. He could just throw it out, like it
Mm,
would be good. Like he could just produce something, but for whatever reason, we don't know what it is. The only facts we have is there's no book for 10 years, right? So
mm,
like, that's the objective fact is there's no book for 10 years.
yeah,
But what we can do is control what our reaction or how we view that. And I reached the Zen state for that. He doesn't wants to move on. Okay, he can move on if he wants to. That's I support that. All right.
perhaps that's part of his plan to help us achieve enlightenment, to accept the long night, to accept the winds of winter, and only when we've lost all hope will he give it to us.
Yeah, that's right.
That was the message all along.
It makes you put other things in perspective in terms of time. I guess like you're like, oh, this is not so long to wait for this thing for
Yeah,
something else, right?
yeah, absolutely. And again, I said it at the start of the episode, like part of discovering his other works was that long wait and wanting more.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there is heaps more, which is kind of the good news. There is actually heaps more. I would highly recommend people get Dream Songs, which is a great collection of his
Mm-hmm.
work. Definitely get that. There's a lot of what you love about Song of Ice and Fire is in that collection. So if you're sick of waiting, go get that.
Not only is it a good start introduction for a lot of these more established works, it even has like some of his like really old works, like when he was in university or like maybe even younger. I remember, right? It has like kind of stories of like really old stuff that he kind of was working on. So
Yeah,
yeah, Dream Songs is
there's
good for that.
There's a superhero story that he wrote as a teenager, I think, called Only Kids Are Afraid of the Dark. And then there's another one that I think he wrote for university, which is kind of like a historical short story
Hmm.
about a siege in Russia, was
I
it
wonder
maybe? Or
what
maybe
grade he got for that. Like, what if he got like a bad grade? And the prof's like, "You're never gonna do well here,"
you'll never amount to anything, Matt.
or maybe he got an A. Maybe he got an A on it. Who knows? Like, I wonder what that
Yeah,
prof thinks. Like, well, like, would it be funny if they see this? Like, what did he turn out to be later on, right? Like his writing ability. But
yeah.
hmm. Yeah. Anyway, this is the furniture rule that you mentioned earlier. I called it the furniture quote. He's talking about just like different types of stories, just use different materials, but it's really just getting the same kind of thing, right? The same end point. So.
Yeah, and it's something that he describes the genre, like any, yeah, he very, as we said before, he very easily slips between those two things. Like there's a lot
Hmm.
of horror in A Song of Ice and Fire. He's able to slip between those moods pretty seamlessly.
Hmm.
But in fact, there even some of his works are sort of dramatize that tension between science fiction and fantasy. Like I think Bitter Blooms can be read.
Hmm.
It begins seemingly as a fantasy work, but the character is sort of premises they're running through a forest being hunted by vampires or something in the dead of winter, and then they come across a spaceship. So it's showing the kind of the two sides of the coin of fantasy and science
Hmm.
fiction. Science is fantasy by another name, that kind of thing. Magic is just things we don't understand. And also other works kind of argue for the importance of having this sense of fantasy and not trying to explain everything. Like
Hmm. Good point.
what was the one
Morning comes
with
mistfall, and yeah,
yeah, with
yeah.
Morning Comes Mistfall, which is set on this planet, um, which is supposedly haunted by these uh, spirits called wraiths and covered in this mist that creates this really beautiful haunting atmosphere. And then a scientific expedition comes and tries to determine, are there really monsters out there, or is it just superstition? And so it's showing that science can explain things, but maybe we don't want everything explained. Maybe there's things about the human spirit that needs a sense of mystery and a sense of wonder to give it meaning. Maybe science isn't the be all and end all. There are other things we need.
Hmm. Yep. And I guess the next thing we have, you want to mention just the Thousands Worlds wiki.
Oh yeah, so this was partially a product of the COVID lockdown and having a lot of time on my hands, but also um, doing the different reviews of the different uh, Martin short stories on the Bastards of Kingsgrave podcast. Um, and I found myself getting very confused while reading some of these stories. Like I couldn't keep track of the planets and the history, so I decided to create a wiki
Hmm.
of Martin's Thousand Worlds universe. Um, so it's a fandom wiki. So the website is grrm-thousand-worlds.fandom.com, and I've got a list of all the works that are considered part of the Thousand World universe. So all the short stories, as well as Dying of the Light and Tough Voyaging, and each work has an article on it, which includes a plot summary, a list of sort of themes, author's notes if they were included in Dream Songs, publication history, adaptations, and connections to other Thousand World books. And there's also a list of the different planets and worlds in the Thousand World universe, a sort of history timeline, if you want to get around that, and a list of different species that you encounter in the series. So, I mean, the works are. you can read these works on their own. You don't have to have an understanding of the universe. They work as self-contained
Hmm.
stories, but I think you can get a new layer of enjoyment out of it if you sort of get a sense of how the stories are connected, the sort of narrative connections, the thematic connections between these sort of stories. I think is a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun for me.
Yeah, I really enjoyed going. Just well, we're still going through it. We covered most of them, but we're moving our way through Tough Voyaging hopefully next.
Hmm.
But and so like as you said, many of the works that we covered are in this Thousand Worlds, and some are not. They're just other independent works of science fiction or fantasy or horror. One that we didn't actually talk about, but I think it was the first one for our Vassals of Kingsgrave kind of review series was Unsound Variations, where
Hmm.
George taps into his chess history because George was a chess player and he even judged chess tournaments and stuff. And it's a really interesting chess story. Like I really enjoyed that. It's one of his better short stories actually, Unsound Variations. So there's just so many different types of works that he's done. Like it's just worth it if you, especially when if you're stuck here waiting for the next book. Well, why better? Like what's a better opportunity to go look at George's earlier works and enjoy that.
Do you have a favorite couple of short stories by Martin? I mean.
Yeah, probably. I mean, in terms of like the top rated ones, like the ones that would get the highest rating, I think Unsound Variations is one of them. Like especially because it's standalone, you can just go read it and deal
Hmm.
with the issues there, and it's interesting. So Unsound Variations for sure. And then more in the A Thousand Worlds, then Song for Lie is very good.
Hmm.
Sand Kings is very good. Um, is it In the House of the Worm that we covered
Yeah.
recently? I only read that recently. I really enjoyed that as well. I thought that was really good. And Second Kind of Loneliness as well. It's pretty good. I thought George conveyed in a good way that whole concept of loneliness, and like you can certainly see that if you go too far in that route and don't find some kind of connection or way out of it, you can get into very extreme situations and have psychological problems and whatnot. But many people have
Yeah.
experienced the an arc of that, a taste of part of that, right? Of that kind of loneliness at
Yeah.
some point in their life.
Yeah, that's a really good one, a second kind of loneliness. I think Martin describes it as like he basically opened a wound to tell that story
Hmm.
because and you can really feel it. There's something really intimately painful about that story. And I sort of have felt a lot of similar feelings as that story conveys. So it's almost like you recoil from that story because there's something painfully truthful about it.
Hmm.
Um, I think some of my favorites, Portraits of His Children is a really
Mm,
good one.
yes.
That's one of his later short stories, and by later I mean sort of late 80s. Um, and he talks a lot. It's really about the sort of what it means to be a writer, the writing process, the characters you create, um, and the sort of the tension between the the fantasy world that you create and the real world that it stems from. Um, And I mentioned Sand Kings and Meat House Man. I'm a big horror fan, and they're two really good horror stories.
Mm,
And finally, The Stone City, which we reviewed last year, which is a very surreal work. It's probably as far away from like human affairs that Martin goes because it's about a character that basically goes into alien space and is interacting with all these alien creatures and gets just sort of marooned on this alien planet. But I don't know exactly. I can't put my finger exactly why I love that story so much, but it has such a deep yearning and a sense of wonder and a sense of like existential angst about the insignificance of human beings in the cosmos and this search for some kind of conclusion that you never quite feel. So I really love that one as well.
Portraits of his children, as you said, is kind of meta in the sense that George himself is kind of reflecting on his own writing and what it takes to where he drew upon it sometimes, like inspirations, and maybe a writer might go too far, or how a writer sees his
Yeah,
own works. So
like
that is still
sometimes
good
you
work.
put
Yeah.
I mean, going back to Second Kind of Loneliness and how he describes, opening up a wound to write that story. Sometimes you put too much of yourself.
Hmm.
There's a danger of putting
Well,
too much of
that might have
yourself
been
into a
even Meat
story.
House Man. I think he probably opened up multiple wounds for the different stories. I think Meat House Man is the most extreme, and maybe
Yeah.
what opened the wound was. But you can see the path from Second Kind of Loneliness to Meat House Man. You can see how that type of person in that type of situation, like if they keep
Mm.
on that path. Well, even Second Kind of Loneliness itself, we won't go to the ending, but it's not positive.
And
That route,
Portraits
right?
of
Yeah.
Portraits of Your Children feels uh, almost biographical in the sense that it's showing the effect that the creative process can have on like family members.
Mm-hmm.
Like the fact that you put so much of yourself into your work in some sense means you're depriving yourself of your loved ones. You're depriving yourself of the real world, or you're taking the experiences of loved ones and almost stealing it for your work. And
Mm-hmm.
there's almost like a betrayal in that, which I thought was really well dramatized in that
It also
story.
has a very strong sense of dread too during the story itself. Like not only does he deal with those philosophical issues, the story itself is exciting. You're like, oh, this next thing is going to happen, right? So
Yeah.
it's just I don't know if were you with us when we reviewed Remembering Melody? That's another kind of a horror one that's pretty well. And again, he drew upon
No,
past
no,
experiences. Yeah,
I didn't view it, but I've read it. Yeah.
yeah, good. So here we have what we normally would do at this point in the live convention is take questions or comments. But since this is online, what we decided is if you have any questions or comments on these issues, like just send us a tweet, a podcast of Ice and Fire or VOK Podcast, actually, right? It's at VOK Podcast, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
VOK Podcast is the Twitter handle. APOIF is the Twitter handle for Podcast of Ice and Fire. But you can also just leave comments on the video, on the YouTube video when it's released
Mm-hmm.
during the con. And so when the con, so unfortunately, because it's a virtual con, we can't answer questions in person, which we'd love to do. But if you just post the questions while the con's happening, we'll just check YouTube or we'll check Twitter, and we can answer you there if that's cool.
Yeah, and if you want to check out the reviews that we've been doing, we have them in audio format at Vassals of Kingsgrave, like if you want to listen on your podcast player, or if you prefer it on YouTube, most of them have been released on the Vassals of Kingsgrave YouTube as well. So that's another medium you can enjoy them at.
Absolutely.
Well, good. Thanks, Duncan. And as always, I enjoyed covering these other works with you as we do on those various
Yeah, no.
podcasts.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Amin. It's fun to be back at Ice and Fire Con again.
Yeah, and I hope everyone is enjoying the online convention. Looking forward, hopefully, to get it back in person the year after and get past this pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thanks, Duncan.
All right. Thanks, Amin. See ya.
Cheers. See y'all.